Everything changed when a line labeled secure quietly stopped meaning anything. For months, Russia's military command had presented its rear areas as sealed, layered, untouchable. Maps were shown, doctrines referenced, assurances repeated, until they hardened into assumed fact. The phrase secure zone was not descriptive, it was declarative. It told officers where risks supposedly ended and civilians where fear was unnecessary. This confidence shaped logistics, command placement, and political messaging. It allowed resources to flow forward without guarding the rear, and it allowed leadership to speak in absolutes. That certainty rested on process, not proof. Defensive depth was inferred from distance, not verified by constant pressure testing. Surveillance reports were filtered through expectation. Warnings that did not fit the model were downgraded, delayed, or reclassified as noise. In this system, security was treated as a static condition rather than a variable requiring continuous defense. Publicly, officials described an impermeable buffer. Privately, orders reflected routine, not urgency. Command posts operated on predictable schedules. Supply nodes expanded rather than dispersed. Legal responsibility diffused upward, assuming that the premise itself would never be challenged. This was not arrogance alone, it was institutional habit reinforced by repetition and authority. Then came small, verifiable anomalies, a disrupted convoy, a communications blackout lasting minutes too long, footage that could not be immediately dismissed or fully explained. Each incident was isolated, labeled manageable, and absorbed without escalation. None demanded immediate reversal of doctrine, but together they suggested movement where none was supposed to exist. The door was still described as locked, even as the hinges began to flex. The confidence rested on maps that appeared precise, but encoded outdated assumptions as fact. Operational charts showed layered buffers, overlapping patrol zones, and response corridors calibrated for a static enemy. These maps governed everything: where command staff slept, where fuel accumulated, where legal responsibility was presumed minimal. Once printed and briefed, and they became authoritative objects rather than living assessments. Doctrine followed the paper, not the terrain. The defensive model assumed predictability. Threat vectors were drawn from earlier phases of the war, when Ukrainian forces lacked reach, coordination, and sustained intelligence. That version of reality hardened into institutional memory. Updates arrived slowly, filtered through hierarchy shaped by what superiors expected to see. Intelligence that contradicted the map was flagged as anomalous rather than urgent planning cells optimized efficiency, not resilience. Rigid assumptions replaced adaptive thinking. Patrol frequencies were calculated against known patterns, not emerging capabilities. Surveillance assets were allocated where breaches had happened before, not where pressure was likely to appear next. This created negative space areas deemed safe by omission. Within those spaces, procedures relaxed. Vehicles moved without escorts. Command routines became visible. The system rewarded continuity, not skepticism. This was not a failure of information alone, but of structure. Decision-making flowed upward through layers that punished deviation. Officers learned quickly that revising the map implied admitting previous certainty was misplaced, that carried professional risk. It was safer to adjust language than redraw lines. As a result, institutional confidence remained intact, even as the factual basis eroded. On the ground, reality diverged quietly. Terrain features exploited gaps doctrine did not recognize. Movement occurred where no movement was expected. Each successful transit reinforced the flaw. Yet the map remained unchanged, still briefing certainty to those who relied on it for safety, legality, and control. The collision between representation and reality had begun, and no one had formally acknowledged it yet. Reports did exist, but they arrived fragmented, delayed, and softened by caution. Field officers logged irregular movements, signal losses, and contacts that did not fit of doctrine. Each report entered a system built to smooth anomalies, not amplify them. Language was calibrated, verbs were conditional, timestamps slipped by the time information moved upward. Urgency had been translated into procedure. Communication lines compounded the failure. Secure channels were saturated with routine traffic, while emergency pathways required authorization that itself depended on senior availability. Some messages waited hours for clearance. Others were rerouted, summarized, or merged into daily briefs where deviation disappeared among statistics. The architecture of command favored continuity. Silence was not absence of data. It was the product of filtration. Inside headquarters, hesitation took institutional form. No single officer owned the problem. Acknowledging escalation would trigger legal and operational consequences, redeployment orders, public explanations, responsibility assignments. In that environment, restraint felt safer than alarm. Officers deferred decisions upward, while superiors deferred interpretation downward. Authority existed everywhere, accountability nowhere. Psychological pressure mounted quietly. Junior analysts questioned whether their assessments justified disruption. Mid-level commanders weighed career risk against abstract danger. Senior officials waited for confirmation that could only arrive after intervention. The chain of command became a loop, not a ladder. Each level expected the next to act first. Meanwhile, signals continued. Communications dropped in places that had never dropped before. Logistics schedules broke rhythm. Markets outside the battlefield reacted subtly, pricing uncertainty without naming it. Yet no decisive order followed. The system remained formally intact, procedurally compliant, and operationally stalled, holding its breath while the cost of delay accumulated beyond calculation. Legal thresholds were crossed without recognition. Command responsibility blurred as procedures replaced judgment. Every unanswered report increased exposure, narrowing options. Intervention became heavier the longer it waited. By refusing to decide, leadership made a decision by default, allowing momentum to shift without formal acknowledgement inside the system itself at scale. Confirmation arrived without ceremony. A live feed flickered, coordinates verified, timestamps aligned. Ukrainian units had moved inside an area previously labeled secure, not as a probe, but as a controlled presence. This was not speculative intelligence or partisan messaging. It was operational fact, visible to anyone authorized to look. Within minutes, certainty collapsed into reaction. Command posts nearest the breach were suddenly exposed. Locations chosen for efficiency, not concealment, appeared on targeting lists. Staff scrambled to relocate equipment that was never meant to move under pressure. Orders were issued, revised, and partially countermanded as situational awareness lagged behind events. Defensive assets turned inward, attempting to seal gaps that doctrine insisted did not exist. The confusion was structural, not emotional. Response protocols assumed peripheral contact, not internal penetration. Units trained to repel advances from defined directions found themselves improvising against movement already behind them. Air defense grids hesitated, uncertain whether new signatures represented threat or friendly displacement. Each second spent clarifying multiplied vulnerability. Reactive measures carried immediate cost. Supply routes froze as commanders attempted to verify safety. Communications traffic spiked, overwhelming channels already strained by earlier silence. Legal thresholds were crossed in real time as emergency authorities were invoked without clear chains of responsibility. Every decision now carried retroactive scrutiny. Externally, markets reacted before officials spoke. Risk premiums shifted, insurance rates adjusted, logistics partners paused, none required official confirmation, the pattern itself signaled escalation. Inside the system, leadership confronted an inversion of power. The initiative no longer rested with the planners, but with those exploiting the exposed seams. Analysts documented the breach as precedent, not anomaly. Noting its reproducibility under existing conditions, no thorough evaluation followed. The intrusion was recognized, then isolated. Tactical containment supplanted strategic clarity. Control had not vanished, but it was no longer centralized. And the question shifted from how the zone was breached to how far that incursion had already extended outward. Publicly, the message never changed. Statements emphasized control, routine operations, and localized incidents already addressed. Spokespersons spoke in absolutes, framing the breach as misinformation or exaggeration. The language was legalistic, designed to preempt liability and reassure partners. Certainty was projected because certainty was required to maintain leverage. Internally, posture shifted immediately. Emergency protocols activated without announcement, command posts dispersed, sensitive archives were moved, travel restrictions tightened. These were not symbolic gestures. They were containment measures acknowledging vulnerability. Orders were marked temporary, yet none carried expiration. The system prepared for recurrence while denying precedent. Narrative management became operational priority. Information flows were centralized, approvals narrowed, and briefings sanitized. The objective was not persuasion, but delay, buying time before external verification hardened into consensus. Markets watched these signals closely. Insurance adjustments, shipping hesitations, and currency hedges reflected confidence leaking faster than statements could replace it. Institutional pressure widened beyond the military. Regional administrators demanded guidance. Legal offices assessed exposure under emergency statutes. Allies requested clarification that could not be provided with contradiction. Each request forced another layer of messaging, increasing the risk of inconsistency. Authority remained visible, but strain appeared in cadence and repetition. Psychologically, the split between public certainty and private alarm carried cost. Officers tasked with enforcement knew the narrative did not match conditions. Compliance replaced conviction. Historical patterns were familiar. Systems that insist on control while internally scrambling invite accelerated loss of credibility. Moral authority erodes first, then operational freedom. No single announcement reversed the breach. Instead, silence filled gaps where explanations should have been. The state continued to speak with confidence, even as its actions signaled caution. And that divergence created a question no statement could suppress. Every adjustment made behind closed doors increased the distance between declared stability and lived reality, ensuring that the longer alignment was avoided, the greater the eventual reckoning would become, still unmeasured, still officially denied by authorities responsible for preventing it entirely. Once intrusion was verified, strain spread across systems never built for inward failure. Logistics networks tuned for forward movement suddenly needed redundancy, diversion, and concealment. Fuel depots shifted, convoys halted, inventories recalculated under pressure. Each modification consumed time and authority. Efficiency collapsed into friction. And friction revealed how tightly everything had been bound to the original premise of safety. Command culture amplified the strain. Decision rights were centralized on paper but fragmented in practice. Emergency powers overlapped with routine authority, creating legal ambiguity at the exact moment clarity was required. Orders conflicted, not because leaders disagreed, but because procedures had never anticipated simultaneous defense, denial, and continuation. Responsibility blurred as compliance replaced initiative. Legal exposure expanded alongside operational stress. Emergency measures triggered statutory obligations, reporting thresholds, and liability chains. Every unacknowledged breach widened potential culpability upward. Advisors warned that delay compounded risk, yet formal acknowledgement carried its own consequences. The system oscillated between action and avoidance, unable to settle on a stable posture. Economic signals reflected this instability. Contractors demanded revised terms. Transport insurers recalculated premiums. Supply partners slowed execution without explanation. None of these actors required briefings. They read patterns. A single breach had introduced doubt into contracts, timelines, and forecasts previously treated as fixed. Historically, institutions fail not at the moment of shock, but when stress reveals design limits. Here, those limits were visible. Redundancy was insufficient. Feedback loops were slow. Authority depended on narratives already compromised. No collapse was declared, no verdict issued, yet the system was now operating beyond its tolerance, absorbing pressure it could neither release nor fully contain. Leadership watched indicators rise without selecting a corrective path, aware that any decisive move would formalize failure. The breach had stopped being an event and become a condition, one that continued to load the system with consequences still accumulating, still undocumented, and still awaiting a moment when denial would no longer function under sustained internal strain. The verdict is not tactical, it is institutional, and it is final. A secure zone was declared, defended, funded, and legally assumed. When it failed, the failure did not belong to a unit or a moment. It belonged to a system that substituted confidence for verification and hierarchy for accountability. Historically, institutions collapse when doctrine hardens faster than reality evolves. This pattern is documented across wars, markets, and states. Maps become myths, procedures become shields, and responsibility migrates upward only after denial exhausts its utility. Here, the breach exposed command culture as the primary vulnerability. Decisions were centralized without ownership, authority exercised without consequence, and silence rewarded over intervention. Legally, the boundary is clear. Once intrusion was known, duty replaced discretion. Emergency powers used without acknowledgement did not remove liability. They intensified it. Every delayed report, every managed statement, every procedural deferral extended the chain of responsibility. This was not flawed information. It was bad faith execution under pressure. Geopolitically, the consequence is irreversible. Credibility operates on precedent, not reassurance. Allies adjust posture, adversaries recalibrate risk, and markets price exposure long before official recognition arrives. Control, once questioned, does not return through assertion. It returns only through structural change, and no such change occurred here. The final judgment is unavoidable. The system failed to protect its assumptions, failed to correct its models, and failed to act when correction was still possible. Leadership did not lose control in a single moment. It surrendered it incrementally by choosing delay over decision. This is not a warning or a forecast. It is a record. The breach stands as evidence that authority without accountability collapses under pressure, and once that collapse is visible, no declaration can reverse it. It closes the case. Power detached from responsibility cannot secure territory, command, or legitimacy, and when exposed by a determined adversary, the resulting loss propagates through law, markets, alliances, and history until the record replaces the narrative and the system answers only to consequences it engineered, denied, and finally owned by those at the top alone.